Joining me on the panel tonight is South Australian Liberal MP Nicole Flint, member for Boothby, Labor Senator Jenny McAlister from New South Wales and Victorian Senator James Paterson. I want to start, if I can, Nicole Flint, with this issue of a 2-year-old child raped in Tennant Creek, moved to Alice Springs, and then because of the severity of her injuries, which you can only imagine if perpetrated by an adult, was then airlifted to the Children's Hospital in your hometown of Adelaide. It's been made clear today that the child was known to authorities, that there had been multiple reports about the family, plenty of alcohol-fuelled violence in her neighbourhood. There was this comment today from the acting Chief Minister that I want to play you and then just ask for a response on this issue. Let's have a look at the grab.
As acting Chief Minister and on behalf of the government, I take that responsibility on board, and we have failed that child, and it's not good enough, and we have to do more, and we can't see more children being failed in the system out there and more children on the ground in the Northern Territory being failed.
When are we going to learn, Nicole?
Peter, this is obviously sickening and it's just not good enough. In my home state of South Australia, we've had some terrible failures in child protection as well, so unfortunately I'm very familiar with these sorts of issues that are a genuine failure. There's several things. Obviously, the department needs to be very closely examined as to how it's responding in this instance. We need to look at, obviously, issues within that community. Are there things that we could and should be doing through the cashless debit card, for example, which controls people's spending in terms of alcohol and discretionary spending in terms of drugs? But separately, I think we also need to be looking very carefully at what are we doing to protect children at risk? Are we placing them with foster carers? Are we giving people the opportunity to adopt them? I've written a number of columns on this issue, and there are so many children in our society who are desperate for a safe and loving family, and yet it is incredibly hard to adopt children in Australia.
I'll come to you, Jenny McAlister, just on that point that Nicole made. In your home state of New South Wales, the government has made a rule that if a family gets into trouble with frequent notices to Child Protection Services, they're given support to clean up their act, they're giving counselling services, they're giving other agencies to help them out. But after 2 years, if children are still at risk, that family is no more progressed in getting their act together, those children are removed into permanent care and are on their way to adoption. We're very comfortable doing it when it relates to white children, but there's still, certainly in the bureaucracy, a real hang-up about removing Indigenous children. We hark back into all the stolen generation stuff. But because we look backwards and not forwards, we're robbing a whole generation of Indigenous children in these dysfunctional families where they're reported to the police time and time again, where a 2-year-old is raped, allegedly, by a 24-year-old adult. Something's got to give. No, something's got to give.
This is a horrible story, and it's almost hard to know just at a human level how to react to reports of violence of that kind inflicted on a 2-year-old child. In terms of what the policy response ought to be, I think the key to all of these things is identifying ways that we can intervene well before this kind of violence even becomes a possibility. And to be honest with you, I don't think that our bureaucracies yet know how to do that effectively, and particularly in very remote places. We have Aboriginal communities asking to have things, to do things with us rather than to have things done to them. I don't think the bureaucracy's worked out quite how to do that in any systematic way.
Well, just on that,
and my gut instinct is that until we do find a way to work with community leaders to establish programs that allow us to intervene in Aboriginal communities where things are going wrong, I think until we're able to do it with community, I don't think we'll succeed.
Okay, so I agree with that sentiment, but there are multiple Indigenous communities that sought the Parliament's okay to move with the cashless welfare card, to bring those cards into the communities. The women I met in those 2 trial sites told me that they believe it works. This is when I worked for Tony Abbott. Since that time, the statistics are clear. A 50% reduction from primary responders, a 50% reduction in violent crime. It works. So why, if Indigenous communities are saying they want this card, did Labor block it in the Senate last week?
The message from Indigenous communities is not at all clear on the card, and Peter, I too have travelled into some of these remote areas and the story is very, very mixed. One of our objections is in fact that the consultation with communities is inadequately broad or comprehensive to really establish what the view of that community is. But our broader objection is that these sites were established as a trial. The data that has been provided to date has been heavily criticised as being unable to establish really any clear story about benefits. We've said, let's extend the trials, let's give the providers a chance to establish a clear data set that shows a clear pattern of improvement, and then we'll consider whether it ought to be extended. I think that's a pretty reasonable compromise under the circumstances.
James Paterson, just on this point, the Indigenous activist class will always squib on these sorts of issues, but the Indigenous people at the coalface in communities, I have to disagree with Jenny McAlister, they want these sorts of trials. Now, right now, we're taking a punt that these dysfunctional families don't all end up raping their children, as is this case. And it's not an isolated case. Go and read Little Children are Sacred, and it is not an isolated case. Why don't we take a punt in favour of the child? And okay, we mightn't have perfect consultation. We might rub a few people up the wrong way, but why are we letting these communities just roll into years of dysfunction and we lose a whole generation of young kids?
Well, that's right, Peter, and I'm very pleased with the really early results we're seeing from the cashless welfare card, and I'm delighted it's going to be rolled out in Kalgoorlie in addition to the current trial sites. I'm disappointed that the Labor Party refused to allow it to be rolled out in Bundaberg, which is actually not a community predominantly of Indigenous people, but other Australians who have the same kind of issues. But on a broader point, Peter, I've never been to Tennant Creek, but my wife went a few years ago, and from what she describes, it sounds like it's a pretty bleak place. It doesn't sound like there's much hope for the future. There's next to no private sector employment. And ironically, though, for a town of 3,000 people halfway between Alice Springs and Darwin, it's actually got quite a lot of government services. It's got a Centrelink, it's got health services, it's got a school, it's got a police station. It even has a NDIS office because it's one of the trial sites for the NDIS. And yet, despite all those government services, there is still some horrific and serious problems in Tennant Creek. And I think that says something pretty fundamental about these remote towns, and particularly these remote towns that have no private sector employment.
I'm going to move on, but I'll just make the point. Tennant Creek is on a national highway. It's not particularly remote. I've been to far more remote places than Tennant Creek. But when I was there, when the paycheck came in on welfare, the shutters came down, the front doors were all locked, the glass was, the panes of glass in buildings was covered up, bottles and cans and rocks and sticks get thrown. It was like Mogadishu. It was like a third world town, and it's in our own country. So let's just leave that there. There was a speech today by Peter Dutton at the National Press Club. It was a very wide-ranging speech. He made remarks a little bit in relation to immigration, but his real import was about cybercrime, cyber security, protecting children in the new world in which they grow up and live from pedophiles and other people that want to exploit them in the online environment. Interestingly, and I make this point with the trial that's going on now with Neil Prakash, the Australian involved in ISIS, before the courts in Turkey, and the question of whether he'll be extradited. There was a lot of grappling by the minister with this issue of dual nationality and how to remove the nationality from someone successfully in law. And James Paterson, apparently the laws as drafted have some flaws in them that need to be remediated. How important is it that we deal with the issue, not just of the dual nationals, but also the Australians, and we think there's about 140 of them still overseas who fought with Islamic State, from coming back here and causing problems in Australia?
That's right, Peter. I think it's fair to say that the government has found it more difficult than we thought it would to remove citizenship from these dual nationals who have been identified as fighting with terrorist organisations abroad, including ISIS, and most Australians would find that bewildering. They would just want us to be able to rip it away straight away. Obviously, we can't just have that discretion completely in the power of a minister. Obviously, we need appropriate checks and balances. It has to go through a legally robust process because Australian citizenship is something that we all cherish and we all value, and it shouldn't be able to be taken away by the government for no reason. But if we're able to establish that someone is fighting for a terrorist organisation internationally, which the Australian government has listed, then it must be straightforward and possible for us to take that person's citizenship away.
Jenny McAlister, can you hear me? Because you had a bit of problem with your audio. Terrific.
I can hear you, although not much of James.
Okay. I just want to make the point, when I worked for Tony Abbott and dealt with the national security issues with the Labor Party, with Bill Shorten and his office, there was a lot of cooperation across the board on these issues, and Labor supported the dual national legislation. But that works if the perpetrator, the terrorist, has a nationality of another country in addition to Australia. If they have just Australian nationality, up until recently, the only option was to allow them to come home and face Australian courts and an Australian justice system, because Australia is a signatory to a UN convention regarding a statelessness, not making any person without a home. However, the United Kingdom has a new thing called temporary exclusion orders to deal with people that have only UK citizenship. And what it does is it prevents them returning home to the UK and causing problems. I've argued that Australia should look at these UK temporary exclusion orders. It's something the government has not ruled out. I asked Peter Dutton about it last year. Do you think that's something the Labor Party would be prepared to look at?
Well, as you observe, we do work very collaboratively on the joint committee that oversees these matters, and in fact that's a committee that I sit on. If the government was to bring a proposal like that and it was supported by advice from the intelligence agencies, of course we would look at it, as we look at all serious proposals that are brought forward in relation to national security. One observation I would make is that prosecution here isn't the only consequence that might befall some of these characters. They might find themselves falling foul of international criminal sanctions in other countries where they've been off behaving essentially illegally, and those are other options that those people. Those are other options for dealing with those people, of course, is allowing them to face justice in another criminal justice system.
Nicole, Flint, most Australians would say they gave up their right to come home when they went over there and took up arms against the West and became jihadists and in some cases, decapitated people, journalists and others, aid workers in the field in the Middle East. Is that a fair point?
The behaviour is grotesque.
Yes, sorry, Nicole Flint. Nicole Flint.
Sorry. Peter, we've just got to do everything we can to keep Australians safe. So, as you've said, the Minister Dutton's having a look at this. I'm sure he's considering all options available to us. We have a great track record on strong borders, keeping Australians safe under the coalition government, and I have huge faith in the Minister to do so, look at all options and make sure we are keeping Australians safe.
Okay, I'll come back to immigration and our questions from viewers after this break. Stay with us. We'll be back soon. Welcome back. Still with me is Nicole Flint, Jenny McAlister and James Paterson. We're going to start with some viewer questions. They come in and every Wednesday we ask them of the politicians. They've got nowhere to hide because I'll keep them honest. I might start with you, Nicole. This is very topical in South Australia because this morning you would have woken up to front page headline from Jay Weatherill announcing that your good old state of South Australia, blackout capital of the world, is now going to head down the path if he's elected to 75% renewables. The question from Rob is, why are both parties so intent on making us pay exorbitant prices for electricity when 62 countries are building 1,600 coal-fired power stations now?
Well, Peter, as a South Australian, there is no one more conscious than me of the impact of high power prices on my households, on businesses, hardworking Australians, and also the dangers of too much reliable on renewables. So I am absolutely stunned that Premier Jay Weatherill has come out today and said he's not only going to continue with his 50% commitment to renewables, he's going to increase it to 75%. He said when he introduced his target that it was a great big experiment. That great big experiment has utterly failed. It's delivered the world's highest electricity prices and also the worst reliability in the nation. That's exactly what we shouldn't be doing. We need baseload power, reliable baseload power, affordable baseload power through a variety of sources, gas, coal in particular.
Jenny McAlister, I know you're going to hit me with Labor solidarity here, but this is crackers, surely.
Peter, there's just one reason why Australians are paying so much for their power, and it is that the Liberals have made a complete mess of the national electricity market. It's a national market and people are not investing in it. There's 50% of our kit, our generators are at the end of their usable life. They need to be replaced, but there's very limited investment, and it's because of the uncertainty. The uncertainty about how we're going to deal with our carbon commitments, uncertainty about whether or not we're going to modernise the grid to deal with the new technologies that are coming through. And it's been a shambles. And the failures in South Australia, but also the failures in Victoria and New South Wales to be able to maintain a reliable supply really come down to that. That there's an ageing kit, but no one's investing in the new replacement generation capacity.
I'll go to James Paterson to respond in a minute, but you referenced it's a failure in South Australia. The Labor Party's been in power in South Australia for 17 years. So are you saying that Jay Weatherill and your Labor colleagues down there have not done what's needed?
Peter, it's a national electricity market.
No, but you referenced South Australia.
It relies on private sector investment to generate adequate levels of generation capacity to meet demand. That has not happened over the last 5 years. Investment has gone off a cliff because people were so uncertain about what the policy settings would be on climate change.
Okay.
And that suited your old boss, Mr Abbott, and it suits Mr Turnbull, because both of them are incapable of resolving this issue in their party room. But it's Australians who are picking up the cost, picking up the pieces.
Well, just on that point, re the carbon tax and other things, people voted in a landslide election to get rid of it. But James Paterson, just to you on this issue, you've got to love Labor. You know, they like to talk about a market and they want the market to work and they want investment. But electricity in this country is not a market when you've got one side of the equation heavily subsidised, and which is renewables, and the other side of the equation, which is our baseload capacity, coal in particular, but also gas, not at all subsidised. So there's an inequity in this so-called market. And of course, no one's prepared to have a conversation about nuclear. If you really want emissions and you want baseload, you'd have a conversation about nuclear, wouldn't you?
Look, Peter, I agree. Jenny's half right. It is a national electricity market, but for some reason, South Australians pay the highest energy costs, have the least reliable energy system, and the most investment in renewables. And they've been blowing up coal-fired power stations. Now, that could be a coincidence, but I suggest it's probably not. When Jay Weatherill promised a 50% renewable energy target in 2014, household power bills have gone up $500 a year since. So his 75% promise is unlikely to make things better. On nuclear, I'm with you, Peter. I think we should have a debate about nuclear power in this country. I'd be very open to nuclear power in this country. Sadly, I don't think it's something that's going to happen anytime soon because of the lead time, but I think we should start it now.
Jenny McAlister, this one's to you. You're a senator in New South Wales. It's not just Sydney you look after it. I know you know that, but it's right out west. My family was staying out in Walgett for some years. My mum was out there and her sister was out there, so I understand how dry it can get out west of the Great Divide. A question from Linda is, when are we going to do something more about harvesting water and stopping our farmers suffering?
Well, probably disagree with Linda. The problem, if you go and talk to farmers up and down the Darling River, as I have in the last few months, is that they'll tell you that too many people are harvesting too much water upstream. And what the Murray-Darling Basin Authority has said really clearly is that New South Wales and Queensland have no effective mechanism for either measuring or controlling the amount of water that people are taking off the floodplain, and that this failure to regulate the system is putting enormous pressure on downstream communities, including, you know, fruit growers, small-scale irrigators on the Darling, but also the town of Broken Hill, which has had very serious problems with its water supply in recent years.
Nick, just so that I don't run out of time, Nicole Flint, you're a South Australian. Water is a huge issue for you, and there was trouble the other day in the Senate with the basin plan, the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. What's your view?
That it was such disgraceful behaviour by Labor to side with the Greens and Xenophon. They are putting politics above people. It is just disgusting, quite frankly. This basin plan has been a cooperative effort by every single state over a number of years, and we have to get it right. We have to get it right for the nation. We have to get it right for South Australia in particular. We're at the end, obviously, of the Murray. We have livelihoods dependent on this, our environment. And I want to say, Peter, what really upset me most about Labor coming into government, well, one of the things that upset me when they came into government following the Howard government was that they almost completely got rid of investing in infrastructure upgrades. So whether it's dams, whether it's lining channels, whether it's putting in more pipes, South Australia was ahead of the curve on this, and it's really almost criminal that the Federal Labor Party didn't support John Howard's very good plan to look at investing in water infrastructure so that we are saving every single drop that we can.
Spoken like a girl who grew up in a farm. I have to give it to you, Nicole Flint. Look, I want to run to the last question here, if I may, because I don't want to miss it out. It's from Kerry. Poor old James Paterson, you're going to have to cover everyone on this. It's a pox on all your houses. When are you going to listen to the electorate? Most people are disillusioned with the major parties who don't seem to understand what we want. We want less migrants, cheaper electricity, and politicians who actually do the job they were hired to do, rather than appeasing minorities and protesting against each other. What do you say to Kerry?
Well, I hear the frustration, I hear the anger, and it's sadly pretty common these days. And I think our profession, as a class, is probably held in lower regard by the community that it has in a long time. I think there's a couple of things we can do to address it. One is act on the kind of policy issues identified there, but also speak a bit more plainly, speak a bit more honestly, be a bit more direct, set aside the talking points a bit more often, and hear what people have to say.
Nicole Flint, you've got about 30 seconds, but there's been a bit of brouhaha inside the coalition today about immigration. You listen to comments like that from real people who want not necessarily no immigration, but they just want the rate slowed down. Is that a fair point?
Peter, Minister Dutton has said that he's having a look at this. The Treasurer has warned that there could be a cost of $4 to $5 billion if we drastically cut migration in the country. I would just note, as I did last time I was on your show, we have such a wonderful history of migration in this country. It's why we are one of the most diverse, successful, tolerant and respectful nations in the world.
Well, let's hope that tolerance continues. I reckon it's starting to wear thin. Thank you very much for your time. You've been a wonderful panel.